So I have used dev containers to solve a very specific problem that I have. And the more I work with dev containers, um, the more solutions I find and the more benefits of them. So here I have a project that I maintain, which is a decade old. There's a Rails API as a backend server, and there's a separate AngularJS application, which is a SPA that talks to that API. There's also a mobile application, which is separate from this, which we're not looking at. Now, as I say, these are a decade old, so they were built well before the modern tooling that a lot of people are used to now, and things were done the same, but also differently. So even though this is AngularJS, it uses a Ruby static site generator, which is called Middleman, which is the granddaddy of a bunch of things which people might be used to these days. Quite similar to Jekyll. It was an alternative to Jekyll at the time. It was really great to use. But the problem with both of these is that because they're so old, they use versions of Ruby and many dependencies, none of which actually work or are very challenging to have work. Neither of these projects will run natively on this machine that I'm using here that you're looking at. This is an Apple Silicon ARM processor, M1 iMac, just the entry level, cheapest. It works. Well, it doesn't work because it won't run natively on here, pretty much no matter how hard you try. I had been developing these with a old ThinkPad, which was running a very dated version of Ubuntu. That in itself was actually becoming quite a nightmare to maintain. It also meant that to do any work on this project, I needed that machine. Now, the closest, or another alternative to this, it was actually Windows 11 with WSL2. I find to be the next best solution to get it running. But anyway, the point I'm making here is that anybody that's onboarding onto this, or anytime I use a different machine or something like that, it can take hours and hours to set up the project in that environment. The environment has different dependencies, different versions of software, different hardware, all of that, and it's just a lot of effort before you can even actually do any work on the project, just to constantly try to keep the project development environment running. So these dev containers are absolutely brilliant in solving that problem that I have. So basically what's happening is that these two separate projects, neither of which can run natively on this computer, they're both running in Docker. And the beauty of it is that to set up your development environment on whatever machine, all you need is Docker and the dev containers extension by Microsoft and VS Code running. Now, you don't even need that. You can actually just go to the GitHub projects on GitHub, click the GitHub Codespaces drop down, and open the development environment in a web browser tab, and that's it. You can start working with these dev containers. So Codespace is one use, but local development is another use for them. And the biggest part about it is that all of this setup can be scripted. So basically, both of these projects are using Ubuntu 18.04, which is the oldest supported right now, and I need those because of various libraries like libssl, which are deprecated and removed from newer versions, and you would have had to compile those old versions to try to get them to work. It's a whole adventure to attempt to do that. But with dev containers, this is significantly easier because we can just say, I want a dev container that's using my Docker file. So this API, it's also got another image, so it's running a Postgres database, it's running a Redis server, and all of this is just scripted, just works. So I'm going to rebuild the container now, which would be the equivalent of just opening the repo in VS Code. And you can see that it's going to run through. It's pulling the base image. This is Docker. It has all of this cached already, so it's a bit quicker than if it wasn't cached. And now it's running my post create command. So this here is my own setup script, and it works through a environment setup. So we've just disabled the RI docs because that takes a while to install, and I don't need those in this environment. So now we've just set up the Ruby version with RVM. Anybody who knows NVM will recognize this syntax because that's what NVM later copied from the older Ruby world. Then we are updating Ruby gems. We're installing our Ruby dependencies. Bundle install. Node users will know npm install. Much the same. Again, this is where all of that came from, the Ruby world. Now, copying my database configuration over, and this is automated. So in the example that I've built, it just works for the dev container to connect to this Postgres server with all the correct settings. So it just works. There's no setup. There's no anything. Even just getting Postgres installed and running on a native local environment, that itself can be quite an issue. Now what it's also going to do after it's done that is it's going to run all of the Ruby commands to create the database, load the schema, run the database migration, and seed it with development data so that you can just start working. I'm just going to leave that for a moment and go over to my artifact of a spa. I'm going to rebuild this container as well, and you can see it's going to basically do exactly the same thing. We've pulled the image down. It's installing what it needs. Give it a moment to come up. Now we're running my post commands, so we're running my setup script here as well. So this is doing something very similar. It needs Ruby, it needs RVM. Note how it's a completely different version of Ruby as well. It needs Node as well. It says Ruby, there's NVM being installed. It installs the Ruby dependencies, installs the Node dependencies, and then it's done. So this is just running through right now. It's setting up version Ruby 2.3.1. I think that was deprecated by about 2014, but never mind. Let's run with it. It's only 8 years out of life. So this is done. It ran all my database migrations and everything like that I needed to get going. And we're just going to open the shell here. It's already set everything there, and we're just going to start the server. Okay, so now our middleman AngularJS Spa is installing its Ruby dependencies. Over here, our Rails server is now running on localhost port 3000. It's automatically forwarded the ports. Localhost port 3000, it's now accessible. Now middleman app is very close to being installed. So again, basically this is, you just clone the repo and open it. It does its thing, and there's a development environment. Regardless of the operating system, regardless of the computer, if it has Docker, then there's an extremely good chance that this just works. Now, lots of people have been having a lot of issues with Apple Silicon and M1 machines to get Docker working for some reason. Personally, I actually haven't had many issues. This seems to work just as well on my Linux machine, and just as well on Codespaces, and just as well on Heroku, and just as well on DigitalOcean. My Windows machine. And those are all vastly different hardware and setup, and this is working on all of them. If you give it a moment, this is very close. So now, same thing here. This is all just set up and just working. Yep, and now my SPA would be accessible. It'll automatically pick that up and forward the port. So now it's 4567. So I could go to a browser, or I could open a browser from here. And this would talk to this API and everything would work. I'm not actually going to show you the app though. But yeah, so that's I mean, dev set up, and it takes just as long as you saw it just then to rebuild the containers, and both the app servers are running on hardware that it cannot natively run on. How cool is that? No need to maintain development environments. I can use it on any machine. I could develop this on an iPad in a browser tab. Now, I think that's really pretty cool.